More than 600,000 soldiers died in the United States Civil War, a number that would be much higher if we counted the many civilians who died as a result of the war. Yet comparatively few of those died from combat. It's estimated that two-thirds of the deceased soldiers of the U.S. Civil War died not from bullets, but from disease, the most prevalent of which were the intestinal illnesses, dysentery and diarrhea. It wasn't clear, using medical knowledge at the time, exactly why these illnesses flourished in military camps, but one doctor, James H. Salisbury, became convinced that diet was the greatest cause, and he developed a solution all his own. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
On a stretch of rural road north of Cortland, New York, a blue sign stands with the declaration, "Birthplace of Dr. James Henry Salisbury, 1823. Forgotten today, you might wonder, who was Dr. Salisbury, and why does his birthplace deserve a historic marker placed there by the New York-based William G. Pomeroy Foundation? Salisbury's story begins with the Civil War. Nearly 2 million men served in the Union Army, and they were heavily impacted by intestinal complaints. Union physicians recorded a total of 1,528,098 cases of diarrhea or dysentery, who was grouped together for statistical purposes, and it's unknown how many more cases simply went unreported. While diarrhea today is usually a fairly minor complaint, it is hardly trivial. As many as 95,000 soldiers died thanks to it between the Union and the Confederacy. Suffering soldiers had all kinds of names for it. The Flux, the Tennessee Trots, or the Virginia Quicksteps, among many others. Thousands were discharged for chronic diarrhea, and surgeons joked that they didn't have the guts to stand it in the military. Treatments were essentially unknown. Other cures were less effective. Private John Leopold of the 74th Pennsylvania had a severe case of diarrhea and was hospitalized in October 1863. Doctors treated him with a lead acetate, a mixture containing laudanum and whiskey, sulfuric acid, opium, silver nitrate, belladonna, and ipecac. They even covered his chest in steaming mustard plasters. Leopold still died after 12 days of treatment. At the time, medical theory was poor. Germ theory lay in the future, and the most up-to-date science wasn't even sure what diarrhea and dysentery were. The terms were often used interchangeably, but according to modern science, diarrhea is a symptom, dysentery a disease. Especially early in the war, these diseases struck military camps hard, even delaying campaigns and playing a significant part in lengthening the war as men lay in medical tents instead of marching. Perhaps shockingly, the numbers during the Civil War were even considered better than usual. During the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, casualties thanks to the illness outnumbered battle injuries 7-1, and that ratio was 8-1 for the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. According to an article in the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases, Civil War surgeons thought the health of the Army excellent, while as many as 20% of soldiers lay prostrate in their quarters or in the hospital. The prevalence of disease in military camps is well known, and it was due in large part to poor hygiene and horrific sanitary conditions. Without understanding what caused disease, Civil War camps would frequently dig latrines near rivers, where waterborne pathogens easily contaminated the same water the armies were drinking. Besides diarrhea, the camps were rampant with malaria, typhoid, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Rural living soldiers came into contact with city diseases like smallpox, measles, chickenpox, and mumps. Lack of fruits and vegetables and rations led to more than 30,000 recorded cases of scurvy. Casualty numbers don't include the deaths of many soldiers discharged for illness who died after the war thanks to these illnesses. Even less considered is the number of soldiers who went into battle in serious physical distress from maladies in their intestines, and the large number of injuries that proved fatal only because of the weakness brought on by those illnesses. One soldier complained that inflammation of the bowels was so severe and painful that it seemed as though death would be a welcome relief, even after he had just survived an enemy attack. Dr. James Henry Salisbury was familiar with all of these problems. Born in Scott, New York in 1823, he worked as a chemist for the New York Geological Survey until he earned a medical degree from the Albany Medical College in 1850 and a master's degree from Union College in 1852. Salisbury was an early proponent and researcher on the germ theory of disease, and he began his work studying bacteria and other microscopic causes of disease in 1849. He published numerous works on the subject, including an 1862 report on the cause of camp measles and an 1867 work which described the bacteria, which he dubbed algoid vegetations, in other illnesses like smallpox and typhoid. Primarily, he wrote, he was struck by the almost entire want of medical knowledge in regard to the true causes of disease. During the war, he served as a physician for the Union, and he worked especially at Camp Dennison, about 10 miles north of Cincinnati. He reported the results of his study there in the Surgeon General's report to the Ohio governor in 1864. Salisbury determined that chronic diarrhea and its complications arose primarily from diet, and in an army camp it was attributable to amylaceous or starchy diet they subsisted on. To solve the issue, he put his patients on a diet that consisted of beefsteak with coffee and anti-fermentative medicines. According to Salisbury, the Army was so pleased with the success of his treatment that they asked him to devise Army rations. To accomplish this, he went to Cincinnati, hired 6 men to board with him, and fed them and himself nothing but hardtack and coffee. Additionally, soldiers were often fed salted meat, usually pork and beans. If they got vegetables, they were in the form of desiccated vegetables, compressed into bricks that had to be boiled for hours and tasted so bad that soldiers called them desecrated vegetables. In 18 days, all had consumption of the bowels, he noted, but soon after they changed their diet to beefsteak and all recovered. By his account, he began examining how to make desiccated foods that could bring his diet to the troops, and supplies of his rations were even ordered just before Richmond fell. The end of the war brought the end to the need for his special rations. His method of study, eating a single kind of diet for a number of days to determine its effect, was not new when he tried it for the Army. Throughout the 1850s, he'd gone through a number of experiments involving living exclusively upon one food at a time, and began by eating nothing but baked beans, which after 3 days made him feel very flatulent and constipated, ears ringing, limbs prickly. He also did a series where he hired men, as he had done in Cincinnati, to see what the effect was on a number of patients, and not just himself. In 1858, he began testing his different diets on hogs. By the end of the war, he set up shop in Cleveland, and he devoted himself to treating chronic diseases, especially those which had hitherto been considered fatal. Even in the middle of the 19th century, there were precious few diseases that had medical cures. Smallpox had a vaccine, and it was known that malaria could be treated with quinine, although exact treatments were obscure, and most doctors knew scurvy could be cured with citrus. The importance of sanitation was nearly unknown. While Ignaz Semmelweis had published results suggesting doctors should wash their hands between surgeries, his findings were widely mocked. Salisbury was not the only one to connect camp diseases with diet. Surgeon Joseph Woodward wrote that diarrhea evidently spreads in some definite relationship to the usual conditions of camp life. Of these, it would appear most intimately connected with diet. And the government did attempt to send vegetables to the front. One wartime slogan read, "Don't send your sweetheart a love letter, send him an onion." Salisbury published his research on diets after the war, including a 332-page volume published in New York. For Salisbury, most disease was brought on by unhealthy alimentation, or diet. He thought a primary problem was that food would undergo fermentation, especially fruits, vegetables, and starches, and that this was the primary cause of digestive complaints, and that fruits and vegetables should make up no more than a third of a healthy diet. He claimed that the digestion of vegetables was responsible for tumors, mental illness, and even tuberculosis. He also thought that humans had more carnivore teeth than herbivore ones, which indicated man should primarily eat meat. He advocated for a high-protein, low-carb diet a century before Robert Atkins. Lean meat was the central food of his diet, which he claimed digests easily and quickly. Salisbury suggested that his diet could alleviate numerous diseases, including Bright's disease, diabetes mellitus, obesity, rheumatism, uterine fibroids, consumption, locomotor ataxia, and more. The most important part of his diet was his beefsteak, and he included laborious instructions on how to prepare it. Had to be made with the muscle pulp of lean meat. All connective and glue tissue needed to be removed. The meat needed to be scraped and chopped and then patted into cakes, which were broiled. For side dishes, he advised oysters, fish, chicken, and turkey. By such a natural diet, he concluded, we can maintain healthy bodies and minds and live long. The second important part of his diet was the consumption of hot water, to which lemon could be added. He thought a pint of water at 100 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit should be sipped slowly an hour or so before each meal and again before bedtime to wash out the digestive tract. He had advocated for the hot water cure since at least 1858. He wrote that his diet could help patients lose from 10 to 30 pounds per month. His diet would become highly publicized, and in 1894 a pamphlet was published by a grateful Canadian titled, "Who is Dr. Salisbury, and What is His Treatment?" It included testimonials to the diet's success. The pamphlet claimed it was written so that an intelligent public may see that Dr. Salisbury is neither a quack, fanatic, nor cure-all, but a clever, modern physician with a practical method. The testimonials included notes from the governor of Manitoba, the Speaker of the Senate, and Duke Argyll from England. It's unclear if this pamphlet was actually written by a grateful Canadian or merely a clever piece of marketing by the doctor himself. Perhaps most importantly, his work was the focus of Elma Stewart, an author in England. She claimed that she had recovered from a 9-year illness after reading Salisbury's work, likely his beef statement that he'd published in England about the Salisbury plans for healthy diet in 1887. The next year, he published The Relation of Alimentation and Disease in the U.S. Shortly after followed Emma Stewart's What Must I Do to Get Well and How Can I Keep So?, which went through at least 34 editions and had copious extracts from his work. The first reference to Salisbury steak dates to at least 1884, when Dr. William Pepper referred to it in a lecture about epilepsy treatment. Salisbury rarely or never used the term himself. He had advocated for the ground meat diet since at least 1864 and published a number of works on its use to cure specific diseases in the 1870s. By 1885, the term appeared in newspapers such as the New York Sun, which reported that Salisbury steak appears to give a remarkably good results as a diet. Of course, this steak, it's not really steak at all, and doesn't resemble the modern version and was little seasoned with salt, pepper, or a little butter. In 1889, a Connecticut paper referred to Salisbury steak as the dyspeptic's delight. Later versions began adding gravy and onions, possibly because Hamburg steak was already served with onions and was very similar. It was after 1900 that restaurants and others began adding their spins to the dish, which would lead to it being served with gravy, as is now classic. The name became especially used in the United States during World War I, as English-speaking countries abandoned German-sounding words and chose to serve Salisbury steak instead of Hamburg steak.
Generally forgotten today, Salisbury's diet and beefsteak were famous and extremely popular for a time, and that beefsteak would take on a life all its own after his death in 1905 of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 81.
By 1950, Webster's Dictionary defined Salisbury steak as hamburger steak, and that in turn as A, finely ground or chopped beef, and B, this meat when cooked. The Culinary Encyclopedia of Modern Cooking called it beef mignon and said that it was for invalids. For many, the term is now linked to TV dinners and frozen meals in the years after World War II, when the television set became the center of the American family room. But like many things we take for granted, it has a unique and interesting connection to history.
Salisbury himself, his experiments, and his much bandied diet fell by the wayside. But Salisbury steak lives on.
The William G. Pomeroy Foundation is a Syracuse, New York-based foundation with a dual mission to support the celebration and preservation of community history and to improve the probability of finding donor matches or other life-saving treatments for blood cancer patients. Bill Pomeroy established the foundation in 2005 after surviving acute myeloid leukemia thanks to a match through the bone marrow registry. The foundation also supports a number of programs designed to provide funding for roadside markers across the United States. Learn more at wgpfoundation.org.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.